Hello and welcome to this video, and this is going to be my final video in my history of jazz, part 9, where we look at the 1990s to now, right? So where have we got to? We've got to a division in jazz. Wynton Marsalis has come along and he's created this proper jazz where you play jazz standards and you learn to play the changes and you put your suit on, you respect the art form and you stand on your stage and you play the stuff. And I've really been critical of that. And then there's that sort of the fusion that's still going on, the experimental thing that's going on in the 80s. And if you really want to know my position on that, go and check my video out on 80s jazz fusion, or the video before this where I really look at jazz in the 80s, right? In the last video I mentioned Sting and his band with Branford Marsalis, Kenny Kirkland, Darryl Jones, Omar Hakim. So in the mid-80s, Sting, who was a jazz musician himself, brings jazz players in to play pop music. But it's not fluffy pop music. Sting's one of the great songwriters of all time, but he also gives them space. If you watch the live video, Bring on the Night, they're playing some heavy fusion at certain points. Okay, so jazz, this never gets mentioned, but in the 80s what Sting did is he allowed jazz musicians in, right? So, what do I mean by this? Well, look at the Rolling Stones. Bill Wyman, the bass player, left many years ago, and recently, you know, their drummer died, Charlie Watts. And so they've brought in musicians from outside. So arguably the biggest band of all time that are still going have got 2 positions open. And who do they fill it with? Well, on bass, they've got Darryl Jones from Sting's band. Darryl Jones from the Miles Davis group. The Rolling Stones chose to go to jazz musicians. And who have they taken in on drums? The great Stanley Jordan. You know, check out my video on Steve Kahn, where I talk about Stanley Jordan's drumming. So, jazz musicians, I think in the 80s, those that, because there was that Wynton Marsalis thing, right? Even his brother does this. Branford Marsalis has not got the prejudices against music that Wynton has got. And so he's out doing all sorts of different things. So the musicians start to come into the mainstream. And I think this is something that happens in the 90s that doesn't get mentioned. Is jazz goes mainstream, right? But it does it in a stealth, under the radar type of way. And I want to draw attention to a couple of areas where I could see that happening. So a lot of pop musicians start to use jazz musicians as their players. They start. This has always happened, but it really becomes the way to go. I would say, especially with pop artists that are on the R&B side. If you check out their live band, every single musician in that band will be basically someone rooted in jazz fusion, right? So they bring those elements in. I can remember in the early 2000s, I saw on DVD a concert by Destiny's Child, and it was like watching a fusion band play, right? So that's where the mainstream, influence is, but we see it in other places as well, right? So we see, I think because of the Wynton Marsalis way of playing proper jazz, we see the real jazz musicians who are creative and open are looking at different angles. So let's take Vernon Reid. So Vernon Reid is a jazz guitarist. He came to prominence in the Decoding Society by Ronald Shannon Jackson. Ronald Shannon Jackson was Ornette Coleman's drummer. So he's coming through an avant-garde sort of harmonic jazz approach. He forms a band called Living Colour in the late 80s, early 90s, which is a heavy metal band. But you've got that jazz influence in there, but it's very subtly. Let's take dance music, electronic music. That becomes very powerful in the late 80s, early 90s. And when those artists become big, they have to go out live. And this thing where you go to jazz musicians to play live, right? You start to see that happen. And I think if we take a drum and bass jungle artist like Ronnie Size, his band that he put together in the 90s with Clive Deamer on drums, that had an immense influence on me as a musician, on other musicians. And those guys were playing jazz. It's jazz that's going on stage, A few days ago, I jumped into a mate of mine called Chris Polglass, who is known as Jungle Drummer, and we discussed, that band. And Chris turned around to me, and you got to understand, Chris really made a name for himself with a band in the 90s called London Electric, which where he was playing full-on jungle beats on a live kit. But he said to me, my dad was a jazz drummer. That's how I learned to play. It's all jazz, you see. So we see this fracturing. We see the jazz influence really emerging in all styles of music. We see hip-hop taking on jazz. We see, like things like Guru, Jazzmatazz. We see the Red Hot and Cool. We see bands like The Roots. We see bands like Tribe Called Quest. We hear that jazz influence coming in a really strange way. It's not necessarily in the hands of jazz musicians, but they're collaborating with jazz musicians. You see like the disposable heroes of hypocrisy with Charlie Hunter, playing sort of Joe Pass line, jazz guitar, right? We start to see jazz emerging in strange places and in the cutting edge of popular music, right? Not necessarily jazz musicians. We see other musicians taking the influence of jazz because they can sample jazz, right? Hip hop is built upon sampling jazz. So of course, when they get the chance to play with real musicians, they bring that in. So I think this is something that really never gets mentioned. Is in the 90s the way jazz starts to seep into culture in all different ways. Okay. So I'd like to point to a certain artists that have been really influential on me where I can hear that jazz influence. So the first person I want to tell you about is an artist called Meshell Ndegeocello. Now I'm going to use her to really describe the whole hip-hop thing. So you've got The Roots, you've got Jazzmatazz, you've got so many artists in the hip-hop world that are pulling in the jazz influence. But I feel Meshell Ndegeocello was a heavyweight. Right, an incredible rapper, an incredible singer, an incredible songwriter, and an incredible musician. She plays bass, she plays keyboards, and she surrounds herself with hip-hop production in the early days, but also jazz players. But she's pulling on a pool of New York jazz musicians, which I've never discussed on this channel, but I feel I need to, which would be people like Jojo Mayer, the drummer. It would be, let's think, some of the M-bass musicians. Sometimes you use Gene Lake, who was one of the M-bass drummers with Steve Coleman. And there's a keyboard player that his name escapes me, and I'm sure you'll put it in the comments, that he did an incredible fusion album called Lunar with the guitarist Dave Fizinski, another incredible musician. And all these people are surrounding Meshell Ndegeocello and really informing the music. Any fusion fan needs to check out Meshell Ndegeocello, especially the first albums, the first two albums. The first one's called Plantation Lullabies. Can't remember the name of the second album. I'm sure my followers here will be able to fill you in there, but no, it's not a particular album. Any of the albums will do. Check out Meshell Ndegeocello. Right, on the dance music side, electronic music side, the jungle and drum and bass, like I said, Ronnie Sai is really influential using jazz musicians, but there was a jungle production group called 4 Hero, and by the late 90s 4 Hero had a full-on live band that were sort of almost like an orchestral jazz group that played jungle and drum and bass, and they made an album called 2 Pages. Check that album out. That is one of the great jazz fusion albums of all time. So what I'm describing here is the way that jazz sort of creeps in, to these sort of cutting edge music scenes. I can hear the jazz influences in sort of groups like Massive Attack and Portishead, and especially bands like Red Snapper and Lamb. All those groups are very interesting. I can even hear it in Radiohead. If you listen to the album that came in after OK Computer, Kid A, they're creating almost like a new type of jazz fusion on that album, you know, but there's such a strong jazz influence. And it's quite hard to actually track that. As I'm talking, things are cropping up into my mind, you know. When I was coming up in the 90s, it was interesting for me, being a fusion fan, I found it very, very interesting time to spot these influences coming out. And I was out watching lots of gigs. And often when you would go to festivals and check out artists like the disposable heroes of hipocrisy, you know, what you saw live was so dripping with fusion that that influence was obviously there in a huge way. And the influence of jazz on that scene cannot be, it's everywhere. It's in all sorts of different styles of music, right? I think once we get into the 2000s, what happens then is the internet emerges. Now, up until then, this is jazz is quite an esoteric form. I grew up basically. My life was traveling around trying to find secondhand record shops. The albums I wanted weren't in print. You know, I'd gone to the library and I'd drawn out books on the history of jazz, and I'd read about albums I wanted to get, a list of albums I was looking for, but you couldn't buy them. So I was out trying to get these albums in secondhand records. Now, I wasn't the only person doing this, because with that whole hip-hop thing, they were all doing that too. You know, because these hip-hop artists, their producers, were going through these old jazz albums trying to find breaks. And this creates a history, right, which sort of keeps jazz alive. But once the internet emerges, very slowly, not straight away, you could access firstly information about jazz and then the jazz itself. Now, if you go onto YouTube, you can access the most obscure jazz album in a matter of seconds. All right? But the internet has another attribute which I want to talk about. In the mainstream, because of computers and digital technologies, live instrumental playing is diminished. If you go and look at the charts now, there's not even anybody playing on any of those records anymore, right? What's interesting is that when you do hear someone playing on there, and I think of Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak single that's just been a huge hit record, you hear that jazz is still there and there's still jazz musicians on there playing jazz. But what's kept jazz alive has been that whole Instagram, YouTube thing. And it's made superstars of people like Snarky Puppy. It's made superstars of Mono Neon, Mahinda Day. You know, all these musicians out there getting millions and millions of views playing, which is not just jazz, it's fusion. But also all the jazz, you know, touchstones, every jazz standard that exists, you'll be able to find somebody trying to play it and posting it up. So the internet's kept jazz alive. And I think what's won out is fusion. And I think the reason why fusion has won out, because even with all the efforts of Wynton Marsalis and that crew to keep jazz pure, right? When you see a jazz artist on YouTube, they're always a fusion artist. And I think that's down to the way that what Wynton Marsalis did and that crew did, Stanley Crouch and all that did, was push the jazz musicians out. So the Vernon Reedens went towards heavy metal, you know, and the Meshell Ndegeocellos and the Dave Fazinskis, they went towards hip hop, you know, people went towards dance music, electronic music. You know, the real musicians went to where the creativity was. And you cannot do that unless you're a fusion musician. You cannot do that unless you're a musician that is willing to take your jazz thing and mix it with something else. But of course, these guys weren't like the jazz pioneers, the jazz fusion pioneers, who had only listened to jazz and then had to create jazz fusion. These are musicians who grew up listening to fusion. So fusion became And I'm one of that. I'm that era. You know, I learnt jazz by listening to jazz fusion albums. I've listened to tons of jazz as well. But, you know, but if I'm trying to play bebop or play West Coast or free, it's another style of music. I'm really, me personally, I'm rooted in jazz fusion. And so those are the musicians that have been able to survive. Those are the ones that have been able to walk into the gigs, you know, behind mainstream pop acts, or work with hip hoppers, or work with electronic musicians, or create samples. Those are the musicians who've survived. And I think that's created an environment which has kept fusion alive. So when Instagram and YouTube crop up, that's what's there. You know, the musicians who aspire to play for Justin Bieber or whatever pop artist it is, those musicians are rooted in gospel chops. That whole idea of how you play like that, that's where that realm comes from. If you're trying to play extreme heavy metal, you know, then you're having to deal with musicians like, you're not dealing with Alan Holdsworth, but you're dealing with what Alan Holdsworth's done for the instrument, because he's been so influential in heavy metal. And the same thing with the drumming. It's all come from fusion. So I think fusion, in the end, has become the dominant style. And I think if you were to point to modern artists, right, that are still there flying the flag for jazz, which are relevant, they're fusion artists. And I'm going to give you two examples, right? Ariana Grande, the pop singer, recently did a video with JD Beck on drums, Domi on keyboards, and Thundercat, right? Those three musicians are all cutting edge jazz musicians, right? So cutting edge that they're rubbing shoulders with the Ariana Grande, and they're getting millions and millions of views, right? And today I saw John Scofield playing on a video with Mono Neo, the bass player, and Louis Cole on drums from Noah, right? That is the contemporary jazz scene. It's an exciting scene. All the musicians, Mono Neon, you know, Domi, JD Beck, Louis Cole, all these musicians are highly creative, pushing the envelope of what jazz is, right? And they are fusion musicians. So right at the end of this video, 9 episodes where we started right back at Congo Square and we wound our way up. You know, what we've ended up, I think, is however you look at it, fusion has won out. And it should, because fusion is a stupid name. What we should call it is jazz. Jazz has always been a fusion. It's always taken new styles. And when it stops taking new styles in and transforming them, it's dead. Right? So there is the conclusion of this huge history I've done. Is if you want to be a great jazz musician, right, you need to be doing the 3 things that jazz has pioneered and it's still pioneering. And that is, firstly, that your art form is based upon improvisation, and it's based upon group improvisation, being able to improvise with other musicians and transform music through that improvisation. That you swing, that you groove, that you play in a way that affects people viscerally, and that's to do with the groove, right? And that you have an individual voice, that when you play, you're recognizable. Those are the things that make jazz jazz. Those are the things that jazz pioneered. If you think it's the harmony or the mad scales, or like Wynton Marsalis, it's preserving some archaic idea of what jazz was 50 or 60, 70 years ago. No, none of that is what jazz is. Jazz are those things, right? And when you put all those things together, that creates a machine that can create new music forms. And in that way, everything that's happened in popular music has got its roots in jazz. You know, the guy with the sampler that's cutting samples and trying to put them together, and he's jamming along with those, and he's got a MIDI keyboard, and he's playing stuff and trying to make the beats work, and then when it works and it grooves, it goes, oh, I found it. That person is improvising. They're trying to find a unique sound, and they're grooving. It's still jazz. You know, while musicians improvise, jazz will be alive, because jazz has created the language of improvisation, right? We are going to see a fracturing of that more and more. And the way to keep jazz alive is to be open to new forms, to not see it as some museum piece, right? To not see it as being hallowed, you know, not think that if you don't play the changes, then somehow you're committing a sin. Let's keep jazz alive. Let's keep moving forward. Let's keep playing. Let's keep open to new musicians, you know, and what they do, right? And I think jazz will be there as long as music's played. It won't go away. So that's my final video on the history of jazz. Where I'm going to go next with these videos, I don't know. I don't really want to go back to doing all those tons of ranking videos and holding albums up and goes, here's my favourite, this album, that album. So I think I may well be widening my net of discussion. I'm known as a progressive rock drummer, so I may be going into discussing progressive rock, heavy metal, and all the other fringe, but I don't want to keep doing the sort of top 10 things. I know that's what brings the viewers in, but I'm not going to do that, and I'm sure my viewing figures will go down, which means I won't be doing this as much, but that's where we're at. But anyway, that's where we're at. So if I disappear again for a while, you know, it's because I'm having to think what to do next. But I really work off the comments, so that really does inspire me. So make sure you put the comments in and like the video and everything. All right then, I've done my bit. Thank you for watching this huge history, and I will see you soon. Thanks, bye.